1 year later, does this 65 Shelby GT350 still hold up? Well, here's a quick update and a few things I learned from this project. Hello everyone and welcome! This custom 1/24 scale Shelby GT350 Model to RC conversion is back on the bench. I started this project over a year ago with an assortment of tiny RC electronics and a nearly 40-year-old plastic model kit. The idea was to make this car a fully functional RC model while retaining as much of the lifelike appearance present in this plastic model kit as possible. It was a learning experience for sure, but in the end I was pretty happy with the final result. This particular model kit is one that I've had in the stash for a while. Despite it being nearly 40 years old, I think it's a great design that went together pretty well. Even the original water slide decals went on relatively easily, all things considered. Of course, I'm no expert when it comes to applying these water slide decals, so you'll have to pardon some of the imperfections here and there. Whether that's more on me or just the fact these decals are 40 years old, I'm not exactly sure, but I generally don't focus too much on trying to achieve absolute perfection on these projects. At a certain point, I think it starts to take away from the enjoyment of the hobby. Of course, also with functional RC models, they're frequently being handled and actually driven, so inevitably some little scrapes, scratches, and imperfections are going to occur. I do the best I can, and I like to experiment and try to improve with every project, but of course at the end of the day, the hobby should be enjoyable, so sometimes for me, that means not stressing too much about the little details. If you've been following this channel for a while though, I think you'll definitely see the improvements that have been made over time, both with the aesthetics and mechanics of each of these projects. Now this particular model kit has been reissued many times in more recent years. This 66 Shelby GT350H that I have here is an example of a recent issue of this kit. All of the parts inside are essentially the same, but I'll be talking more about my plans for this kit later on in the video. Like I said, overall very happy with how this car turned out. However, there was one little thing that I wanted to adjust, and that's slightly increasing the height of the front suspension so it's sitting closer to a stock ride height. I know a few of you do like the slight rake that the car has now, but I definitely wanted to adjust the front end, which is certainly easier said than done when you're working with parts this tiny. I squeezed in some slightly longer springs between the lower control arm and the frame to give a bit more support. But after some experimenting, I decided to install some additional springs that sit between the top of the upper control arm and the fender. Admittedly, not exactly the most lifelike setup, however this suspension works great with this current configuration. As you can see, I was able to increase the height of the front suspension to where I wanted without the suspension being too stiff. You can see the suspension working pretty convincingly, all things considered, going over this bumpy terrain. I imagine adding a bit more weight and having more suspension travel in the rear would certainly help, but I'm pretty happy with where the suspension is at right now. One of the best things that I learned from this project was how nice these tiny receivers and ESCs are for these kinds of ultra-scale projects. These are actually designed for smaller scale projects than the 1/24 scale model that I have here, but if you're not concerned with performance, they work great for these kinds of builds because you can hide them just about anywhere. Using electronics that are this small means you don't have to hack up the model to get everything to fit. Soldering together all of these tiny components wasn't exactly my favorite part of the build, but I was eventually able to get everything working. Again, not the best choice if you want to fly around a racetrack, but if you want to build a nice detailed scale model that just so happens to be fully drivable, right now it seems these little electronics are hard to beat. I enjoy looking at the chassis on this car just as much as I enjoy looking at the body. It's not hard to make an RC vehicle with a great looking body, but when you can have a chassis that looks just as detailed, now that's raising the bar. Admittedly, this is not the correct suspension setup for a 65 GT350, at least as it came from the factory. The real car would have leaf springs in the back instead of a 3-link with panhard design, and the front suspension looks quite a bit different. Obviously, it's not at all uncommon to see upgraded suspension designs more similar to this installed on first-gen Mustangs, but in an otherwise stock appearing car, I do think it would be cool to replicate the real-world suspension design as closely as possible, and it's something I'll be attempting on my next model to RC conversion. Unfortunately, no detailed engine bay under the hood. The inner fenders had already been cut out in anticipation of this body going on another chassis, so I didn't bother with adding an engine or any other details under the hood. Instead, it's where I chose to cram all of the electronics, which although not very pretty, it is convenient to be able to pop open the hood and change the battery. Overall, a very fun project that I still enjoy cruising around. Maybe not quite as exciting as some of the faster cars that I've built, but watching something so small yet so lifelike is really cool as well. If you'd like to learn more about this build and watch the detailed step-by-step series I recorded while building this car, I will link that video playlist below in the description. As I showed a little earlier, I do have another virtually identical kit here, which is the 65 Shelby GT350H from Revell. I uploaded STL files of all the custom designed parts that I 3D printed to bring this model car to life onto our Patreon for others to download as well. I figured I'd have some fun and build essentially the exact same car using the same pieces since there won't be any custom design work or guesswork involved, just do what I did with this prior GT350 step by step. That said, I do want to take this car a bit further with a detailed engine compartment, and maybe I can find a few other things here and there to improve along the way. Should definitely be a cool build, but in the meantime, I've got some other projects that I'll be showcasing on the channel in the coming weeks. This 66 GT350H isn't a project that I plan on covering in a ton of detail since I've already done so with this prior GT350, but I should be able to put together a nice overview video of the build process and of course showcase the finished result. But to answer the question of whether or not this GT350 still holds up 1 year later, well certainly mechanically I'd say it's as good as the day it was built, which is nice considering this isn't exactly the easiest RC vehicle to work on. I do think it's been at least slightly outdone in terms of detail by my latest project, that 39 Chevy Coupe, which contains a big block Chevy V8 to conceal the RC motor, along with that weathered paint job and functional lights. Still though, this Shelby is a great looking car and served as a perfect test bed for experimenting with these tiny RC components, and I'll continue to try and take the detail even further with future model to RC conversions. As always, keep an eye out for some new videos coming soon, but until the next one, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.